thanks, Jen, and thanks to the committee, and thanks to the library for putting this on. And I think it's a good sign of a community that you have: one, a wood-fired oven; two, a wood-fired oven committee; three, a library, of course, and enough people to gather who are interested in taking advantage of this great resource that's in your community. I've known about the oven since I met Jen at Sterling. I think your oven was already built at that time. No, it was just getting into that. So I learned about that, like prenatal rumors of that oven, and then have known that it came into fruition. So I think everyone's really lucky to have that here, or have that there. I want to make sure that people feel comfortable with asking questions as we go through, because I think it's always good in the context. I did as much homework as I could about your oven, talking to Jen a lot about how it's used, when it's used, how it's fired, maybe even the design, and because it's a custom oven, so each oven is different, and we want to see ways that we can increase participation at your oven. So I'm going to go into a slideshow. It's mostly photos, and I can kind of show you really what the idea. You know, when Jen asked me to do this, she said what we can do after pizza, and so we're going to kind of follow that heat curve. I'll give a little just kind of background about myself and how I got involved in this, and then how wood-fired ovens work, because I think once you understand a couple of components of your oven, you'll be able to use it more effectively, and with that greater knowledge, it just becomes more and more efficient all the time. When I say efficient, I mean you're able to utilize all the heat windows. So here is your beautiful oven in your town. Okay, so here's your oven, and just a little bit, again, like some history of what has happened. And I think it is interesting because it has been a movement in this country. I'm sure some people remember the beginning. Alan Scott, I got involved in wood-fired oven baking about the mid-90s. Alan Scott had been doing that for a while. He was an Australian. He's passed away probably 5 to 8 years ago or so, but he eventually partnered up with Dan Wing, who lives in Corinth, and is a great baker and interesting guy all the way around. They eventually wrote The Bread Builders, and this again is about 95, 96, and this really kind of is like a starting point as far as this type of wood-fired oven baking, both on a commercial level and in communities like in Johnson. So I met Alan Scott actually before he published that. I learned to bake out in San Francisco. I went to visit him. This is his place. It was his place in Petaluma, and it was the first time I saw a wood-fired oven. And this is Chad Robertson from Tartine, and I just really got intrigued by this style of baking, and also the ability to make it in your own backyard or in a community. I think Jen said some other people might have their own private wood-fired ovens, which we'll talk about a little bit, and that's what I did. I went back to, I purchased some property in North Carolina. I built an oven. So I think this is pretty much what your oven looks like without that beautiful rock facade. And this really kind of is a view into the thermal mass that is the battery of the oven, which stores and retains and then releases heat. This has not been insulated yet. So I did that for a few years. I just had a small little micro oven bakery down on the coast. Then I actually moved to Vermont and started teaching at King Arthur Flour, and now I teach bread baking at Johnson & Wales University in Providence, Rhode Island. But the wood-fired oven connection, I've never lost. I have some new property, and I plan to build another one. It's just, I think, a really nice lifestyle, and I'm anxious to get back to it. So again, we want to talk about all the things that you can do, but I really think it's important that we just talk about a couple components of any oven. And in doing that, you'll know what the capabilities are. And I know that Mark was involved with building it. He might be able to add some detail on what the composition of your oven is, because it's important, right? It's like a vehicle, could be a Ferrari, or it could be a semi-truck. They both will drive you across the country, but the ways that we do that are very different. So two things and different comfort levels and speeds. Two kind of major components, three really, that we should talk about are thermal mass. And this again is the battery. And this is what is going to absorb heat and hold it and then release it so you can make all kinds of different products until there's no heat left. This is an oven that I helped dismantle, which was kind of sad, but it had to go. And so all of this, there's a brick oven box. Like when you look inside your oven, you see the bricks, but potentially on the outside of that, there might be some more cladding or more thermal mass that will take longer to heat up, but take longer to cool down too. And we'll talk, everyone's familiar with baking with heat, because that's what you do, and with fire rather. That's what you do when there's a pizza bake going on. But you can also use that retained heat to bake afterward. And we'll kind of go into some of those, a lot of those different applications. So this is all thermal mass, more thermal mass, longer to heat up, longer to cool down. And this is a question to think about, like, what's the purpose of the oven? Is it a commercial enterprise and you want more? If it's your backyard oven, you can get by with less. So we want to heat it up, but just like in your home, we want to insulate it. And so this is, these are insulation blankets that are on top of, this is the first oven I built down in North Carolina. And, you know, once you have all that thermal mass heated up, or even as it's heating up, we want to be able to keep that heat in there. And there are a lot of different materials to do that. The oven should be insulated underneath, and that could be as simple as vermicrete, which is a mixture of cement and vermiculite, not nearly as efficient as calcium silicate board, but a lot less expensive too. And then on the top are kiln blankets, and those are highly efficient and really keep the heat in there. I think one of the rewarding parts of having an oven are identifying all the different heat windows that you can do something in. And if you can slow down the dissipation of heat, it will lengthen or open the windows, the ranges where you can do those things and have it last longer into the future. So thermal mass, insulation, and then really the third element, and this really truly is an element, right, is fire. And Jen asked to have this addressed as well about firing schedules. You know, based on what I just said, those firing schedules will be pegged to the amount of thermal mass. But no matter what the thermal mass, it's always good to have an efficient fire. And this is a technique called the top-down burn. And I know I'm speaking to people in a part of the world that probably burn a lot of wood, or a lot of experienced wood burning people. And for fireplaces and ovens, this is a nice technique called the top-down burn, where the larger stuff is on the bottom and then successively smaller pieces and kindling on the top. This works really well in fireplaces as well, anywhere you really need to build a fire. And the idea is that if you start that kindling on top, it will instantly start to burn. And then that heat radiates in all directions, right? It goes down, it's 360 degrees. So not only is it just burning itself, but it's warming the material underneath. A lot of the energy that we get out of burning wood is heat generated from gases. So as the wood underneath heats up, it releases gases, it goes through the flame, and then that ignites and combusts, and it's just an upward spiral as far as heat efficiency. The whole place gets hotter faster, and all the gases are consumed and contribute to that upward spiral. And then it just keeps on going. And you know, you will have some smoke. I think we all should be responsible as far as emissions and having things heat up as quickly as possible. There will be some, but we can minimize that time. And the top-down burn really helps that happen. This is maybe in the first couple of minutes where there's that, well delineated wedge of cool air that's being drawn in. So when you open the oven on your door, open the door on your oven, the oxygen flows in along the hearth. It helps the fire combust, and then it's exhausted up the chimney. It's still not super hot, right? It's just getting going. Here you can see it's probably below 550, 600 degrees, and you can determine that because the bricks have not burnt. The soot hasn't yet burned off the bricks. In the next photo, you can see that it has. So that's, you probably have an infrared thermometer, but this is kind of a good, sign that it's starting to get hot and heat up all the soot. I do want to point out too that I like to keep a clean oven. There's radiation coming off the flames, off the fire, and that is going to be absorbed by the thermal mass. And so we want as much residential time for that heat so that it can get absorbed, but we also don't want like a physical barrier between the fire and the masonry. So when things burn down and there are ashes or embers, I want to clear those out or redistribute them so there's a straight line between the fire into the brick, right? It's just like as if there was some sunscreen on your nose at the beach. We actually want, in this case, the rays to go into the oven. So I'm always trying to clear stuff out once it's fully combusted. I don't believe the Johnson oven has an ash dump. Unfortunately, I haven't visited in person, but I've looked at a lot of pictures. You can see an ash dump in the beginning, in the forefront of that photo, and that's easy to get rid of stuff. You can just brush it forward or use a hoe, and it'll fall down, and you can get it out of there without having to scoop it out. If you are thinking about building an oven, an ash dump is something that I always really recommend and encourage. It makes it, I think, a lot easier. But if you don't have one, no reason to get excited. So the oven is increasing in heat, in temperature. Again, I know I'm speaking to a bunch of people who are in a wood burning part of the world. So everyone is probably aware of needing well-seasoned wood to burn so that you're not using energy to boil off water. And smaller, fairly small pieces too. If you can split it down pretty thinly, 3 to 4 inches, you'll get more surface area. And again, we can get the temperature up more quickly. I'll go back one photo. Part of what I think an easy technique too is when you are firing is to preheat wood. So the Scandinavians have done a lot of work as far as efficiency in wood burning devices, and this goes back to like the 1700s with masonry heaters and those types of designs. But if we can keep the firebox temperature as high as possible and the combustion rate as efficient as possible, of course, you're just going to continue to have an efficient burn. So what I would do, like in a case like this, you can see this is pretty skeletonized top-down burn. It'll probably topple pretty quickly, but then I just lay wood, in the mouth of the oven and literally preheating it. So when you put it on the fire, or it may just start to combust, you aren't taking a bunch of cold wood and putting it on the fire and kind of dampening it down, right? I just kind of want to have a gentle up curve on that. And that certainly could happen in your neck of the woods where it's cold and the firewood might be literally frozen. And if you put it in there, temperature will drop. So I try to bring it up. Firewood. So what we're doing is continuing to push energy into the battery. And the longer and at a sustained rate, the longer you can keep a sustained rate of efficient combustion, the more heat that you can efficiently gather and store in the masonry. And that will be really useful tomorrow. It's true that it's getting hot, right? And you can live fire cooking, you have that flame in there, you're making pizzas. That is going to benefit directly from having that fire there, but we also want to put some into the thermal mass. So all along, when you are setting up your tables and getting your protocol set up for your community pizza bakes, fire's going right along and heating up. So I know we want to focus on post-pizza products, but it should be noted that during the fire up period, there are things that you could do that could directly relate to your pizza bake or have for later. And one of my favorite things to do are just ember roasted vegetables like radicchio and endive. Onions are a special favorite of mine, and peppers, just like, you know, you have roasted red peppers. The onions, I know Jen's fond of these too. You just literally put some onions in there and the outside carbonizes, they cook all the way through, and you just have this really fragrant, well-cooked, smoky orbs of translucent oven that you can use on pizza or for whatever you might have besides that. Okay, so we're still kind of going up toward pizza, and then we're here, right? And so it definitely seems like you have a handle on the pizza side of things. Again, there's live fire cooking here. I'm not exactly sure the size of the oven, but I know you have enough room in there so that you can move pies in different places to absorb heat. Because again, we're thinking about after the, you know, pizza curve, after the climax of the pizza night, what we're going to cook with is all of this heated thermal mass, and it is doing it here, even though it's still charging, right? There's heat in there, and that's flowing into your pizza and making the crust like nice and light. We have a couple different ways that we can cook with the heat in a wood-fired oven. This one is taking advantage of radiation because of the fire, and then also conduction. There's heat in the bricks already, and it's flowing into the dough. There's also some convection that's happening, probably not quite as much here because the fire is taking a lot, or is kind of depleting the convection effect, but it'll play more into the cooking methods when there's not a fire there. So pizza, okay, you guys, you got that down, which is always a nice thing to have down. So there are other things too. And again, I've thought about this, like, you know, there's a Monday night pizza night, but I know that people can sign up and do other things too. So, you know, you might want to just do some live fire cooking. Maybe not on that Sunday when everyone's getting set up for pizza, but the night before, which would help heat the oven up too. Or maybe the day after the pizza bake when the oven's already got a little bit of preheat. So anything you can do on a grill, and you can do in this appliance. So I love cooking with fire. It's just really a wonderful way to make some food. And then we can kind of go into the bread baking phase, which really is a distinct way of using a wood fire oven, and it requires similar types of preparation. So pizza bake, that's all over. We still have a hot oven, and we're going to want to get it ready for bread baking. So bread baking is in a retained heat environment, so there's not a fire in there. You might do it with some pita or with some flatbreads, but that radiation can really give you a lot of color pretty quickly. So definitely any type of leavened bread, you're not going to want to have fire in there. So we're going to clean it out, right? And here's the ash dump in action. You can rake it forward. This oven is actually pretty cool, I can tell, because I know that's like a horsehair brush for cleaning just ash, but you probably have a wire pizza brush or a hoe at the site to get hot stuff out, right? And again, boom, it just goes down into that stainless or galvanized garbage can. I put a lid on, and then it cuts off oxygen. So What you have then is a really hot, clean brick box. And this might be 700 degrees. We've reached the climax of how hot it's going to get. It could hopefully plateau out and hold that temperature for a long time, but we're not putting any more heat into it. So there's only one way it can go, and that's down. At this point, we can say a few things about heat saturation. Ideally, that thermal mass, however much you have, is thoroughly saturated with heat. So if it's 600 degrees on the facing of the brick that we can see, it's 600 degrees on the side that we can't see, because that's our battery. It's fully charged. And as we bake and cook in this environment, we're going to take some of that, but the heat from the outer part of the masonry will migrate in and it'll recover. So we're above baking temperatures and want it to cool slowly. I'll say, Jen said the next morning it might be 200 to 300 degrees. I think you can probably have that be so it's at a higher temp the next morning, just with firing schedules and maybe sustaining the fire. And we can talk about that more at the end if you want. But we have the ability to have that temperature be more where, a little bit warmer the next morning, more than 200 to 300 degrees. At this point, though, we might be 700 degrees. And then we're getting ready to bake. I'm not going to go into the whole bread baking process, although I do like that stuff. And but what we want to think about is having the oven be ready to bake and having the dough ready to bake. And I assume there are some I know there are some accomplished bread bakers and other people who do it at home. And so this is a little bit different. This is one of the variables as opposed to turning on your oven and being able to bake it when the bread's ready. So, and part of that is observation and record keeping and saying, okay, we started the fire at 5 o'clock on noon on Sunday. We baked, and then I know that the oven's going to be ready for baking Monday at 7 a.m. or so. So we're getting ready. Again, no fire in the oven. It's cleaned. It's slowly cooled to bread baking temperature, and then we're getting ready to bake. So one of the things that I don't want to talk too much about bread baking, more about ovens, but this is part of the process of being able to use a wood fire oven well with pretty results and delicious results. Have it the proper temperature. We're going to score your bread, of course. I know you probably have all the tools like peels. And then one step that's distinct to bread baking, and you don't have to do with live fire cooking, is put some steam in the oven. And you can do this with a pressurized garden sprayer. Have little pans of water in there. It's hard to tell, but this is a towel that's on the inside of the door. So when it's sealed, it creates a gasket and also gives off more steam. And this is a major step in having bread that comes out really beautiful and has cuts that open and have larger loaves. And this is kind of bread baking chemistry, is we need a couple things for that to happen, to have those really caramelized crusts. If you've baked bread before that came out of the oven matte colored, or cuts didn't open, it might be split along the side. It could be because of lack of steam. And we need steam, high temperature, and residual sugars from fermentation to get all these beautiful things. In your part of the world, Elmore Mountain Bread, who bakes bread in a wood fire oven, they consistently create really beautiful stuff and have for a long time. And that's because they're paying attention to these things. It's properly fermented bread. The oven is hot, and they introduce steam in a couple of different ways to create this. So it's another step that in a huge, post pizza bake period, a technique to follow to get really good results. So, and then the bread is loaded. So now we can just talk about, what we're going to bake. So we still have a really hot oven, and we know that we can put stuff in there and it's going to get done really quickly. So we purposely choose things that enjoy a high temperature. So pita is one, and this would be an easy one for you all to do, because if you have leftover pizza dough, it'll work just fine for pita. You can roll it out and put it in the oven and it'll puff and you can remove it, or make za'atar flatbreads or any type of flatbread type thing that doesn't need a real solid crust like sourdough, but and is thin enough to have the heat penetrate it so it finishes quickly. So pita is a good one to start. In a super hot oven, you might load them, flip them, and pull them out 90 seconds. But you all are used to that type of timing, because a well-heated oven, a pizza is going to be 60 to 90 seconds or so. They're really fun to watch. Kids like to watch them because they're animated, they puff up, and the only thing is to be careful when you're removing them. If you poke a hole in them, this jet of steam comes out and you can get burned. So they're full of hot air. So we're still going now. We're post the other thing. We're post pizza bake. We're in a cooling oven. It's still very hot, but those pita have helped mellow out that crust, that hearth, right? So they've absorbed some of that heat. So now there's more heat from the outer masonry that's flowing in. The pita doesn't take a lot out of the hearth temp because it's not in there very long and they're thin pieces of dough. But it can soften it and mellow it. And then you have, some small little demi baguettes or baguettes. This is a pretty old picture. Baguettes don't work so well in a wood-fired oven. They're hard to load because of the shape of ovens. There are other breads that fulfill that niche, but are much easier to load. Like this one, which is called pan rustique. So this might be a pound loaf, and it is lean. So there's no fat, there's no sugar, there's no honey, and all of those ingredients brown quickly. So by eliminating those in a lean dough, you can have a long sustained bake. And this is what we think of with hearth breads and European style hearth breads that are your daily bread that can take that we want to have be really crusty. And then sourdough bread, right? It can be one thing to mention is full ovens bake better bread, but you could also use some of that heat and create an oven within an oven environment by having a closed container or a covered container and put that into the oven. I have some right here. Let me show you. This applies to baking at home as well, for those who might not have an oven at home yet or don't get down to the community oven. This is a pretty classic piece now. It's called a combo cooker. It's by Lodge. There's this nice little thin griddle part and then a top part. So that's heated. You put your dough in there, you score it, and then you can just put this in your home oven or in the wood-fired oven. Here's a really nice vintage piece. It's pretty big, and so that just can accommodate a bigger loaf. A turkey roaster works. A stainless steel bowl inverted onto a sheet pan works. Anything that is going to have a smaller space, and that's all because of steam, what we mentioned a few slides ago. The steam you can inject with a garden sprayer, but the bread itself is going to give off water as it starts to bake. It will dehydrate, and it's trapped in a small little container, and it'll steam itself. So when you look at this picture, you think, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to go and make 24 loaves of bread. Not necessarily, although it would be cool to do it out of your oven, but you can have an oven within an oven. So we're still kind of going down temps. Now we might be at 450, 500. And the rate of decay of this heat curve has to do with a lot of variables. How much thermal mass you have, how much insulation you have, the efficiency of the insulation, how long you fired. If you fire over the course of 3 days, you'll get more residual heat in there than if you do like one quick firing on one day. And there's not a right and wrong way to do it. There are multiple ways, but when you change the method, you'll probably change your outcome. So as we go through all of these, different breads, you might be able to do all of these, or you might only be able to hit a couple of windows because it degrades so quickly. My small wood-fired, bakery in North Carolina with an oven that was built a long time ago that didn't have the most efficient materials, I could get 10 or 11 successive bakes out of it, starting at about midnight and going to 8 a.m. or so. Because it was all thermal mass, it was well insulated, and it was really well heated up. With this, we're still at the pretty high end of the temperature curve. Plain lean dough, sourdough. This really shows how a wood-fired oven can make a good volume. This is a direct result of the conduction, right? We have all the stored heat in the thermal mass, flows into the bread, all the air cells that you've worked by folding and proper fermentation expand. You can really see, how it streams away from the hearth temperature. So this open crumb is something that we get is, a result of that well-heated thermal mass. And steam, I would add too, because it keeps the outside supple.
Hey, Richard.
Yeah.
When you're checking the heat in the oven, where do you aim the gun? Where do you check the heat?
I have a couple different spots, and I kind of like to graph it. And so it doesn't really matter where, but it's good to do it kind of consistently. And this is kind of one of those tricks or idiosyncrasies of a wood-fired oven. Some of them make perfect sense, right? The back is going to be more hot than the front. So I'll do one like right inside the door, the back wall, the very top of the dome or the arch, and then the middle of the hearth. And it's a good question. It also, those readings are surface temps, not the temperature of the, it doesn't indicate the depth that the heat has penetrated. How do you all take temps in your oven?
Mark, you can unmute yourself, or Luke, or Jasmine.
Well, we use the thermal gun, and we're pointing the gun down most of the time on the hearth, either like closer to the door. We do vary with where, but I don't think any of us have ever thought of doing the wall, like the back walls or the roof, but this is now a very interesting thing to take into consideration, the thermal, the heat saturation.
I'll send some resources out to Jen and she can distribute it, but I'm just going to show you. This is the page in the back of my book. I don't know if you can see it, but it's an oven temperature log. And Chelsea Green, which is in White River Junction, probably everyone's familiar with them. There's just a link to follow and you can print some of those. It's also nice just to kind of begin to learn the characteristics of your oven by keeping track of how quickly it heats up and how it cools down. I'll show you, I'm looking. I'll do, I don't know if you can see this, but you know, I like to graph it sometimes or just make notes of what's happening. You know, a consistent schedule like your Monday pizza bake becomes, you probably have this experience, right? It becomes easier to anticipate, but it's good to keep notes and keep track of things like that. If you do atypical things, if you have a Thanksgiving dinner where you want to do everything, or there's a different type of event out of the oven, keeping track of that will give you some kind of roadmap on where to go. Again, those surface temps, those infrared thermometers are surface temps. Sometimes there are thermocouples that are implanted in the oven. And then there's experience, and there's just the idea of getting to know the oven. So we're continuing down. You know, this again is maybe 450, 500. This is starting to get more whole grainy. This is some sprouted wheat flour, so it's going to be in there longer, right? It's more dense. And it might actually have natural sugars in there, so those can make it a little bit dark kind of fast. So I might be 425 now. This is some 7-grain bread that definitely has honey added to it, so the bottoms are especially susceptible to getting scorched if there's some honey. Larger loaves. It's a 2-kilo loaf. You can't tell, there's no scale, but a big loaf is going to take longer to bake, so we want to go in at a slightly cooler temp. Some rye breads that like a high temp, but they want to kind of go into a lower, you know, a 375, 400 degree Fahrenheit end bake. Right, this is a descending oven now. And then things that are enriched or sweetened. This is pain de mie, which is this classic French sandwich bread, but challah, brioches. This one's a little, I would start out with this one because it's in a square Pullman pan that I happen to have one here. This thing is a pretty nice wood baking instrument in general, but definitely for wood-fired oven baking because it does offer some protection. Baking at this temperature, which is now like maybe 350 to 375, a challah bread would probably get colored really quickly because again, we have this radiation coming down from the dome, whereas something in a pan has the added protection of the pan. And then some very sweet stuff. This is some chocolate pumpernickel bread. It's still yeasted. We still want to have enough temp that we get oven spring, which is that volume increase due to the conduction from the hearth. So at this point now, like 350 or so, that oven spring is going to be compromised when we start going below that, but there's still plenty of heat. And the other thing I should mention is that heat curve now is flattening out, right? It goes up, you make pizza, everyone has a great time. It drops more precipitously, but it continues to like even out and lose heat more slowly. And so I really love this temperature range that we're getting into. For years, I just baked bread in my oven and I didn't have time or energy to do other things, but it's less, the timing is less taxing going into this below 350 because we know it's going to be in there for a long time, right? It's not something that's going to potentially scorch or get burned. So, you know, again, just the next morning, I'm sure you can, it's just fun to think about. People used to cook with fire and wood-fired appliances all the time. So anything that you might have for breakfast on your stove, you could have for breakfast the next day in the oven. Flat galettes, quiche. This is a potato pie that doesn't need to caramelize. It will get brown, you can see, but if we loaded sourdough at this temperature, it would never get brown and it wouldn't be that pretty. But this type of stuff you can just leave in longer. Scones. So we're into kind of classic American baking or, that 350-degree range of scones, pound cake. And I want to point out a couple things with, or at least one thing with this, like in the back, this is a inverted sheet pan. And it's fun to just kind of monkey around. You have the power, and with some extra simple tools, to change the environment that you're using. So if you're baking a pound cake at 350 or 375, you do that because, again, you want some oven spring, but it might be a little hot on the bottom for the whole time and gets what is eventually going to be the top of the cake a little dark. Well, after this gets some oven spring, you can just slide it on an inverted sheet pan, because by doing that, what you do is you no longer have it in contact with the bricks, right? You introduce an air layer. It's hot air, but it's just the same as your double pane windows in your house, right? Air is a great insulator. Air is the best insulator because there's no matter in there to pass energy from molecule to molecule. So you could stack up a couple of upside down sheet pans and still have the cake baking in this hot air, but not being in contact with the hearth. And doing these little kind of hacks, you're like, okay, it's a little hot. That's all right. I got a trick for that. Still, we're about 350. Bread sticky type of stuff is great. Again, it can just stay in there a little bit longer. Now things are getting super gentle, not easy to go in the oven. There's no, fire to contend with. And we've kind of entered braising temperatures and casserole temperatures. If you remember back when we talked about all the high temp things to do, like pizza and the wahoo, that fish, you can also sear things at that temp and then hold them aside and finish them off later. So you could sear a pot roast, put it in the pot with all your vegetables, set it aside, and then later just bring it back to the oven, put it in there, and you have the flavor from searing, but then you have this extended period of being able to cook it slowly. And when you have that heat, like, why not use it, right? I mean, it's great to have a roast cooking away in your home, but it's also great if you have the stored heat close to you to just go ahead and use it for something. And all of you, it seems like the oven's big enough that at this, the next day or at that 300-degree range, it would truly be a community oven where people could bring things and bake them at a slow temperature and then be able to pick them up later or just tend to them. So those are some braised leeks that were steered before and now they're getting braised. Baked beans, classic New England slow cook thing that were put into the oven on Saturday night so as to not break the Sabbath and have them cook slowly the next night. And so there's another little trick, pictured here where the oven might not be that hot, right? It might be like 225, 250. That's not very hot. Of course, you can leave it in there a long time. So by preheating the water or stock, preheating the pot, you can kind of help it along instead of dumping all this cold stuff or ambient temperature stuff into a pot and then bringing it up to temperature. We're going to heat it in stages. So we're getting pretty cool. This is perfect fat rendering temperatures now with suet or schmaltz. I know you have plenty of high quality animal proteins up there and fats to render. I'll go back again to the high temp part of the cooking curve and say that I'd really like to use these when I'm cooking at high temperatures. The smoke point is higher than olive oil or butter. And so you can cook at high temperatures when that live fire cooking segment is going on by using, this type of cooking fat. And we're really starting to get into dehydrating temperatures. If your oven, if you do the Monday pizza bake and it's 300 degrees, the next morning, maybe by Tuesday, you're down at 150 or so. And you can do these things that will be extended, but will definitely get prepared or cured. I should say that, food safety temps, things should go over 140 with like meat, because that will kill harmful bacteria. And so that would be, right above there. And then really low, like 95 degrees. So maybe you're out at Wednesday or Thursday, no fire since Monday, and you can infuse olive oil, and this is like rosemary salt. And then, very low temp drying of herbs. When I first got involved with wood-fired ovens, it was all bread baking. And I read these, firsthand accounts of all the different uses of wood-fired ovens that people would use in their backyard a couple hundred years ago. And I never really fully understood being able to make these things because my oven was always too hot. But once I moved away from North Carolina and would go back and visit, I realized these temperature fluctuations would allow these cooking and dehydrating applications at low temperature. So this is only maybe like 95 degrees, but it's dry. And in the forefront of the photograph is that just small little fan, and that's circulating some air. And that is going to dry those out pretty quickly. And it'll dry them out. They'll still be vibrant. They'll have some color, and just a good way to put up a lot of dried herbs without having to use some other energy like freezing them or using a dehydrator. And then we're kind of right back to where we began with setting a top-down burn. And I don't know if you have this as part of your routine, but what I like to do is once the oven is cool enough, if there is still some ash, I clean it out as much as possible. I'm grateful for the work that the oven has done for me. And I want to set another top-down burn. I want to have it be, like under 200 degrees or so. If it's too hot, you'll pyrolyze the wood. You open the door and it'll just be charcoal. Pyrolyzing is the combustion of organic matter in the absence of oxygen. So it's essentially charcoal. It can be kind of gnarly though if it's just about kind of smoldering. If you had that in there and it was 400 degrees, no oxygen because the door is closed, you open the door, there could be like a little puff of oxygen that could like burst into flames, which is not terribly dangerous, but then your whole top-down burn is gone. So the advantage of doing this, of laying it, is there are a couple. One, you're all ready to go. So next Monday when you roll in, one strike of the match is going to light this whole thing. So that's easy prep. It's all ready to go. You don't have to clean out the oven. The wood is, even if it's not been heat treated, it's been in a dry environment, so it should light right away. And again, be more efficient. It's going to burst into flame, and you'll have less emissions. So it's just that convenience and the ease of efficiency that will start the whole cycle again, right? So you're right back at the beginning and ready to go up, make pizza, and then just go down that downhill slide that we just talked about. So
Barb,
I
I just noticed somebody from the audience. Barb, did you guys have a question? Barb Bertocci? It looked like somebody was raising their hand. No? Okay, sorry. You're muted, Barb.
We're wondering how the fire, that with all that wood on the bottom, how, and just the small stuff on the top, how does that get down to the big stuff?
It will, the top kindling will catch on fire. And again, if this is very dry. If, from 1 week to the next, it will light very easily. And then that kindling will begin to give off heat. And that heat will radiate in all directions. So it'll even penetrate down. It's 360 degrees. It will heat up the wood below it. And in doing that, that wood will start to release gases, right? When we burn wood, we're burning cellulose, which gives off energy, and we are burning off gases that are trapped in the wood itself. And there's a huge amount of energy in those gases. So you have this, burning thing here, it's warming this up, and the gases are coming up, they encounter the flame, they combust, and then that gets hotter. And so then the whole thing just kind of starts to go up and become more hot. If anything, with this texture, I might take one of those pieces out of wood, one of those pieces of wood out of there, so there was a little bit more ventilation. But I know what you're talking about, Barb. It seems like, wouldn't it just kind of burn off from the top? But the whole thing will catch, and it'll combust. In a very big oven, or maybe, your oven seems like it's pretty sizable. You could even make 2 of these like log cabins, so that you can kind of heat the whole oven chamber from front to back a little bit more. At King Arthur Baking in Norwich, they have a wood-fired oven that's quite narrow and quite deep. And so I try to make 2 or 3 of those, and one's pushed back, and then you have this big stack of wood that will combust.
Richard, I think you partially just answered it, but do you tend to start the fire in the back of the oven?
Not necessarily. It depends on the size of the oven, but this oven that we're looking at right now is about 3.5 by 3.5 feet. It's pretty square. And so I have just with one stack in the middle, and again, that will allow radiation all around that burning raft to go out in all of that masonry, up to the sides, the back, and down. If it is a deep oven, a bigger oven, I might light that one, push it back, and then have another one in front of it. How deep is the Johnson oven?
Pretty deep. 3 feet? Anybody else want to add?
Maybe 4 feet, 4 or 5.
You saw that picture, Richard, of me in the oven?
Yeah, this one?
My whole torso, yes.
Okay. So this is the end of the presentation, not your end.
This is
Jen, that makes it a 4-foot deep oven.
this is where we cook Jan.
She sent me the photo, so I figured I had to put it in. So 4 feet, that's 4 feet. So that's pretty sizable. And you're not going to want to crawl in there to light it, obviously. But if you made one of those top down, if you had this, and then had a very wide hoe, or even if you have a pizza brush, you could have that set up, push it back, set another, lay another one or construct another one in front of that. Just like the first one, because the one in the back is going to catch on fire too. And then you will distribute that heat from front to back.
Just for the record, I was cleaning the sand out of the oven when we were building it. That's why I was in it. I don't go in the oven regularly.
Was that a pleasant experience? Did you enjoy that?
Not necessarily. It's a little claustrophobic in there, but it made for a good picture.
Yeah, it is claustrophobic, but I think when you are in there, it's like being in a cathedral. It's close to you, but you kind of understand that this is a structure that has a specific use or a specific use that can be manifested in a lot of different ways. And it's kind of powerful. I can't stay in there too long. But if anyone I encourage you to at least stick your head in there, because it's quiet and it seems like it's a portal into a different world.
Richard, is now a fine time for people, if they have questions, to
Yes,
unmute.
please.
So feel free, if you have a question, to just unmute yourself and ask Richard.
Well, I'll start with Richard. That, you know, when we fire this on, we have the door in it with just a little crack underneath the door to start it, just to let a little bit of air in, because if we're burning dry wood, boy, you can really chug through. It's pretty easy to go through a couple wheelbarrow loads of wood in this oven to get it up to temperature. And it's taken me a few years to figure. I mean, when I first started, I was like starting it the night before. I was so nervous. Now I think we've got it down that we can start it at noon and have it be plenty up to temperature by 4:30, 5 o'clock. I don't think we hardly ever have start the fire with the door out, because I think, like your oven, the flue is right in front of the door. So I tend to start it right there, thinking it's going to heat the floor right where we're going to cook, and then push it back.
Yeah, I think that's a good technique to increase your heat retention. And you can just consider that like a draft door. Do you just lift the door up on a couple pieces of brick or something like that?
Because our door is super tight. You can basically shut the air off totally. Yeah.
Which is good. And that's a really good point as far as the bread baking window as well, is that you want to retain that steam. So if you have a tight fitting door, that's great. You obviously can't have the tight fitting door in place when you are burning a fire, because you need oxygen. But as you say, Mark, if that door is completely off, that heat is just spilling out, and you also might just have a lot of oxygen going in. So you can control that oxygen flow, which can actually increase the efficiency of the fire, right? It's the Venturi effect. It's just the same thing as when you squeeze a hose and make that aperture smaller, the velocity increases. So that's what's happening with that oxygen. It's getting sucked in there and feeding the fire really quickly. You're also, maybe restraining the exhaust from coming out the door, going up the flue, and that increases the residence time of the heat, right? So you're creating swirls of all the heat flows, and that's more time that it can be in contact with the thermal mass. That's more time that, more opportunity for the thermal mass to absorb heat, and then subsequently more time to bake and cook later. Yeah, it's sometimes called a draft door. You might have your perforated door that's maybe not as heavy as the main door, but it'll allow oxygen in, exhaust out, and reflect heat back into the oven.
I just want to really quickly encourage people, if you're local and you want to be in the drawing for a book or an oven t-shirt, put your name in the chat. I've only got 3 people right now. So if you want to be in the drawing for a book or a shirt, put your name in the chat and I will stick your name in the pot. I think, Luke, do you have a question, or Sophie?
Sophie does.
Yes, I have a question. So Richard, I'm wondering, and I'm sure it's very specific to each oven and how thoroughly it's heated and how much heat you're retaining in the mass, but I'm wondering kind of like the shape of the curve of heat loss, and like if there's a range of temperature that falls faster than others, and about like the kind of a window of time that you're holding a temperature. Like say you wanted to do a braise at I don't know, 300 degrees or something like that. Like, would it be safe to assume that you have 6 hours of that temperature, or it depends, I imagine?
It does depend, and you kind of hit on it, like the amount of mass you have, and the amount of insulation you have, and then if you fired that oven every day for a week, your ability to hold that braising temperature for a longer time would be longer at the end of that week than on the second day. Or if you just fired it for one day, because it would just be thoroughly saturated with heat. And so with custom built ovens, it's kind of hard to know like what the insulation system is and how much thermal mass there is. And then again, how long it's been fired. But in general, those high temps, so that like holding it at 500 or 450, that window is much shorter than when you get down. You know, it's that type of curve that you can really hold down here much longer than up here.
That's great. So those high temps, those are falling a lot faster than when you kind of get below like 400 degrees or something. That temperature will kind of ride out a little bit longer.
Yeah, and also how quickly you let the temperature fall. So I always imagine it like if you're rolling a big boulder down a mountainside, you want to control the descent, you know, like how quickly is that, how we're like holding it down. But like at a certain point, if you let it just go, it'll go really quickly. So if we can control the fall or the decline, that will hold it much longer. So if you, at the end of the pizza night, you know, you make sure that the oven is closed up right away. You know, the next day it might be at a higher temperature and hold that longer than you get done pizza, you know, making pizza and everyone's having a good time and the oven door's off for a while and then it kind of cools off. It'll start declining and will be at a lower temperature and not hold that, compared to if you just sequester the heat as long as possible. It's kind of hard to answer this question. You know, it's like so many variables. You want to give some idea, but it's not like, and I guess it's even that way with like home appliances, right? Like how quickly your home oven cools down, and that's part of the charm. They're all individual, and your oven it's got its own personality, you know. Who else?
Jasmine, your hand is up.
Yeah, I was wondering what you said about having an oven inside of an oven if you're just baking off one loaf of bread. I'm envisioning, you know, sourdough in a Dutch oven. And you said something about it's unnecessary to do the whole steam element because it'll create its own steam. But would I want to make a more moist dough? Would I want to be cognizant of that, or would that not even matter? Will it just do it on its own?
It'll do it on its own.
Okay.
Yeah, we're always striving to have doughs be as hydrated as possible and still be able to manage to handle them.
Mm-hmm.
But if you imagine this amount of space, a 680 gram loaf, that's 1.5 pounds, is going to take up, you know, that's going to be like this big. So there's not that much more space in there. And a dough will give off about 20% of its scale weight in water through evaporation. So if it's 1,000 grams when you scale it, when it comes out of the oven, it's about 800 grams. Depends on size and shape and whole grain content and all that. But so that's 200 grams of water, and that's a lot. And water expands greatly, like 1,600 times volume into steam. So there's plenty in there with a medium hydrated dough. You don't need to compensate for your hydration in the dough to get that steam. You know, a bagel consistency dough might not give off that much, but you wouldn't be doing that in that environment.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Who else?
Want to chime in with any questions? Does anyone have questions?
I'm curious about so in the past with the pizza oven, we find that like we've made, made the fire, but then during the pizza bake, we're also feeding it quite a bit. Is that because we're just not up to temp really, or is that pretty standard that we should be feeding it throughout?
No, I think that's an insightful observation. Like you probably aren't up to temp. I mean, if you start it new, it will be hot, but it's not saturated. And again, if you all wanted to do some experiments, and I know we don't want to make it more work, and you don't want to burn more wood than is necessary, but having an extended burn or even a fire the day before, if it's pretty informal, just to kind of get it heated up, you might find that during the bake itself, it doesn't lower quite so much. I do think though, with like community pizza bakes where there are a lot of people in and out and a lot of pies, right? Like 95 pies, that's a lot, or a decent amount, right? It's taking heat out of the hearth the whole time. You probably have had the experience like you want to move the pie around, right? If you put one down right where you removed one, it's not going to bake as quickly as if you put it in like a fresh spot of the oven that hasn't just been heated.
Yeah, I was surprised when you said that. I mean, I guess I've heard this in the past that pizzas really should cook between 60 and 90 seconds. I don't think we're experiencing that.
I think I oversold that, and I don't necessarily think that kind of fell out of my mouth. There's that out there, but I don't think that's necessary. In fact, I think it makes it a lot harder because if it's done in 90 seconds and you get back in there at 120 seconds, it might be too done. It's like pretty stressful. And I think with a 1 or 2 person team where you're like have a system where someone's passing it and you're baking it and taking them out, you might be able to do that. But I imagine that there's probably a lot of hands involved.
Can I
when you do a pizza bake? And so that's time. I'm sorry, say again.
Oh, I just want to hop in real quick and kind of piggyback on Lottie. Not piggyback on Lottie. So as far as like, so say we're doing like 80 to 90 pizzas over a course of like 2 hours or something like that, which is a lot.
Yeah.
And at most we're probably maybe getting 5 pies in at a time. And like when I'm cooking pizzas, I'm trying to keep as many pizzas in the oven at once, but I'm wondering like, is it almost a better idea to say there's 5 pies in the oven, get them all out, give it a moment, like let the hearth kind of come back up to temp and then get more in, or just like rather than instead of continuously loading pizzas in, because I feel like that's going to make that heat crash pretty quick.
It's a really good comment because there is a recharge period, and in bread baking especially, like if you have a whole load of bread and you take it out, that temperature falls, and then if you close it up and let it recover, there's that heat flow from the outside to back to the inside, and then the curve is it goes down, it actually pops back up again, and then you can put in another load. And it's the same thing with pizzas. If there's no dough, like if you're not having anything else cooking there and you still have an active fire, it's going to be recharging the hearth. And I think it's hard with pizza and the community thing, right? Because then there's demand and people are waiting. But sometimes a quick little recharge is useful. And that might be no pies in there, and even put the door, again, having efficient combustion, having some warm wood so it doesn't have to like come up to temperature. It immediately bursts into flames, or small things, small pieces of wood, and blast it. Maybe even have that draft door on there so it reflects heat back in there, give it a little break, and it won't penetrate deeply into the masonry, but it will give another little hit on there. Do you feel like you have enough hearth space? Do you have to fight with do you move the fire around?
The fire typically stays to the back, and we're probably the fire, probably we give it a third of the oven, and then we're cooking in the front 2/3. We could get six pizzas in there, but it's a little overwhelming. 5 is pretty comfortable, but we don't typically move the location of the fire.
Kind of a pain in the middle of cooking because then you have
Yeah.
For the long-term health of the oven, you might want to try different spots though, just so it's not always burning in the same spot. I know some pizzerias with wood-fired ovens where they just traditionally have the oven in the fire in the back right corner. That back right corner gets deteriorated, worn more than the rest of the oven because the fire is always right there. So you can maybe try on both sides. Again, I don't know how wide it is, and sometimes that doesn't work. But there are coal fences too, or like ember fences, where you could have a piece of steel that would just hold it back so it doesn't spill out too much on the, give yourself a little bit more hearth space by just basically having like you wouldn't use a railroad tie, but if you imagine something that was thinner and that was stable and it would just hold back all the fire, you could go right up close to it and it would block some of the radiation.
So I have a couple questions about when we're cooking pizzas in there, we can watch the front of the oven drop in temperature as the night goes on. It can really drop in temperature, sucking the heat out of the bottom. And I guess a couple questions. Have you ever thought, once in a while, I would pull the coals forward and let them sit there for a little bit and then push them back, or even add wood while we're cooking pizzas? I think we do that every now and again. Just put more wood in the back of the oven and try and raise the temperature, because it drops quite a bit. It'll drop 400 degrees during.
Yeah, and that front of the oven is gonna be more cool, right? That's where all the oxygen is being sucked in. So that's a cooling effect. The fire's in the back, so it's further away. And so that technique that you said is a good one, like pulling the coals up. I mean, that means you have a suspension of your pizza bake time, unless you're lifting them over there. But that will recharge, them. So, maybe you could experiment with that if the oven's wide enough. Once you feel like everything is really equalized, instead of having the fire way in the back, you have it off to the side, because that fire on the side that's up front might help charge that part of the hearth. The other thing, and I do this with bread baking too, because there's a heat differential from the front to the back. The back's always going to be hotter, is at the end, or maybe like just before your service begins, you just have you pull all the fire to the front of the oven and try to pre-charge the deck right there, especially with small pieces, not kindling so much, but 2-inch pieces of wood that will combust pretty quickly, and then you can just kind of push them off to either side, sweep the deck, and you'll have flashed that front of the oven.
I think, and I don't know, Luke, if you agree, that there are times that we spin the pizzas because near the door is getting cooler and near the fire is getting hotter, and we have to go in and shuffle them around. In that minute or 2 minutes that they're in there, the back is going to burn and the front's not going to cook, so we have to spin them.
Yeah, that's pretty typical, I think. One thing, I mean, if anyone, Jen said maybe some people were looking at building their own. When I built my first oven, I was not an experienced builder. And every cloud has a silver lining, right? So it ended up being more square than I expected. It wasn't like, she's not narrow and deep. It's more of a square. And that ends up being easier because the heat differential from the front to the back is not so great. And you also have the space on the side. So when it becomes extreme, I think it's really hard to work with. I've worked in like narrow, deep ovens, and the differential is really hard to overcome.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.